Hi, I'm John Atack, and I am very glad to welcome Monia to the show again.
Hello. Hello, hello.
And we decided we're going to talk about nothing in particular. So we discovered that we're both crazy about movies, and so there are a lot of films that are really relevant and thought-provoking, and help us to think.
Yeah.
And some of them are old black and white things. Like I Was a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, for example, which
Oh,
caused a change in the law in the United States, I'm told.
really?
Yeah.
Around chain gangs, I guess? Or so what did it cause? Okay.
Well, you won't see any more chain gangs.
Okay, well there you go. I think I'm trying to think if I know any other movies that like changed laws. I don't think so, but I do remember that just reminds me of a movie that I really, well, it feels weird to say that I loved it. It's called The Tale. Have you
Yeah.
heard of this?
No, I
No.
don't think so.
So The Tale is an autobiographical movie. It's this woman who is a documentary filmmaker who realized at one point that like her mother found these old diaries of hers and was like freaking out. It's like, oh my God, you were having a relationship with your writing teacher? Like, what are you talking about? And she's like, yeah, but we were in love, like blah, blah, blah. And then she revisits and then is like, we weren't like, no, I was groomed and abused. So it's a sort of covers that. And it's done so well. It's done so well because it includes that thing where you see her and she looks like I don't know, like a 16-year-old teenager or something. But then it cuts to, but that's not what she looked like. That's what she thought she looked like. But she was actually just like like an 11-year-old, because you do think of yourself as older
Yeah, of course.
somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it plays really well with that, like what she thought and then how it sort of played out.
Oh.
And because it's her own story, I think it was done really well. And they used like doubles for all of the, scenes. So the kid didn't have to be part of that. That was really impactful, I'll say. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean it is something, over the years, as a kid, I drenched myself in movies, and
Mhm.
the only way to do that, we'd go to the cinema, but
Mhm.
not that often, maybe once a month. So it would be that on a Saturday or Sunday morning,
Mhm.
we had two TV stations back in the old days. We lived in caves, and we'd just come down from the trees.
Yeah, you had to go hunt for your food,
That's it.
right?
Yeah,
Hunter gathering, yeah,
yeah,
like berries
that's
and
it.
stuff.
Lived mainly on turnips and parsnips, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
And but they'd show all of these phenomenal black and white movies on a Saturday and Sunday morning, and so that was age 8 or 9. That's what kicked it off for me. And you sometimes see a film like say 12 Angry Men with Henry
Mm-hmm.
Fonda in, which I showed it to my youngest boy when he was about 11,
Yeah.
and I thought, he's black and white film, this no way, and he just sat there mesmerized, because what you get is some actual acting.
Yeah.
And some, of course, the basic idea is that you've got a young lad who is supposed to have knifed somebody, and 11 of the jurors have decided he's guilty. And Henry Fonda, being an awkward cuss, argues against this, and you see the case being taken apart. It's a play, basically. You're sat in a jury room. You don't get much in the way of action. There are no car chases, but your mind is taken into this thing, and it's the best kind of education, because it's the kind of education that doesn't hurt.
That's a really good point, actually. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's well, because it's not the type of movie where you start crying because it hurts so much. So
but also education hurts because it's boring. And
yeah.
I remember when I was 11, when I went to secondary school, which is what, junior high in the US, and what do you call it in Canada? Is it junior high there, or
Uh that's a
you
good
don't know, do
question.
you?
I call it junior high, but I
Yeah,
attended those grades in Sweden, so I just call them the numbers. Yeah.
fair
Like,
enough.
yeah.
The grade numbers, yeah.
Yeah.
But on a Friday afternoon, we'd have English in the library. And I remember we read Julius Caesar out loud. And I got to be Octavian, who, of course, would later become the first emperor. But I didn't keep the role for long enough for that. And yeah, all the kids are laughing because you're going, prick him down, Lepidus, prick him down. I mean, put him on the list to be executed. But for the most part, the other kids slept through it in this drowsy sort of Friday afternoon thing. And I was just completely taken up with this. So it was one of those rare moments when being at school wasn't crushing and horrible, you know. I'm told that Sweden is actually better than, you know, they have a better standard of literacy.
Well,
but were you in an English speaking or in a Swedish speaking school?
I went to an English speaking school once I started 7th grade. When I got there, I was in 6th grade. And I got to start 6th grade, and I didn't speak Swedish, and that was a Swedish class. Yeah. That's still something that I think about. I'm like, wow, I survived. So that was fun, because I definitely remember sitting there and them just being like, oh yeah, saying my name, which I understood. And then I think they asked like, oh, where are you live? Like, are you living around here or something? And I'm just like, words? What are you saying? So it was pretty slow going. And then you had to like apply for 7th grade, and I ended up finding an English speaking school to go to. I don't know about better, but we did, I've told a lot of friends here about this, but since we're talking about movies, like one of the movies, we got to see a lot of movies that I'm not sure how necessarily, technically speaking, appropriate they were for our age range. Like in 7th grade, we saw Welcome to the Dollhouse, the Todd Solondz movie, which is, you know, quite dark. And I'm just like, why did we watch that in 7th grade? And then there was the Swedish movie Show Me Love, which was one of those, it's teen girls that fall in love. It's one of those really, really early like lesbian love stories. And it's very good and definitely appropriate, but it was just like, okay, interesting. Yeah, I still remember watching Welcome to the Dollhouse. And American History X we watched too, but not until we were in high school. So that's fine. Yeah. But that was still a lot. Like violence in that one. It's like, oh, okay, wow. Watching this. Yeah.
I mean, that's another interesting point, isn't it? My partner's son at the weekend, he's 15, and he watched a horror movie with his friends. And when his mum got home, he got all the lights on, you know, and which reminded me of, I saw Psycho. I must have been about 10 or 11 or something, and it scared me for weeks. And the whole idea in horror that for some people it's cathartic, but for other people it's traumatic.
Yeah.
I having dealt with hundreds of people who've been traumatized in real life, the idea of, you know, dipping your toe in the lake of trauma to toughen yourself up, I'm not sure it's a great idea. What I tend to recommend is watching a documentary about how the special effects are done.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty good. I definitely did that. I tried to harden myself to the horror movies because I could not handle it at a younger age. So I definitely made myself watch a lot so that I could sort of not freak out. I think I'm fine.
Well, yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, how will we ever know? What you should have done was had an identical twin.
Oh,
could have been,
damn it. Yeah.
We could have had as a control.
I missed.
Yeah, it was a bad mistake.
I wonder if it depends on what, because I know for sure the movie that I saw too early, and it wasn't even the whole thing, was Chucky, because that was also like at a friend's house, and it was like something, and I was like, I can't watch this. Like I have to go hide in the closet. But then once I was in the closet, I'm like, there are toys in here. You know, they could come alive. So it was like, oh no. But yeah, it's definitely like horror movies. And I think too, I would assume that this is something that is probably just like a standard young people thing where it felt embarrassing. Like I can't watch horror movies. Like and that was like, oh, why are you such a baby? You know, and you're just like, I gotta harden myself up. But you know, as a grown-up, it's like, well, it's not for everyone.
Is it kind
obviously.
of the Spartan theory of horror movies that children should be left out on the hillsides and the tough ones will survive?
Oh my God. Yeah. We don't want to bring back the Spartan rules. It's a lot.
No, well, there's always somewhere in the world where somebody's doing that, you know.
That's true. Yeah.
Oh what doesn't kill you will make you stronger, though. Most people don't know that was actually Nietzsche who said that.
Interesting.
And he spent the last 15 years of his life in a mental hospital. So maybe it's better to say what doesn't kill you may possibly drive you mad. And
I think that's way more accurate for sure. Yeah.
The idea that breaking somebody's arm makes them stronger. I'm, you know, he was quite a clever bloke, but very strange moustache, obviously. And, you know, I think that's just the stupidest idea, really, that by harming people, and there is, you know, that balance that in movies, I was very interested in as a teenager, two problems. The first was, how could anybody be as nasty as Jack the Ripper and go around disemboweling people?
Okay. I was terrified of Jack the Ripper when I was 10 or like around that age. I thought he was, well, I knew he was from back then, but like there was a knowledge that he was going to come and get me for some reason. But yes, please carry on. Just like Jack the Ripper. I'm like, for some reason, he terrified me when I was younger.
And he's the kind of icon of serial killers. So only 5 murders attributed to him. So Ted Bundy did about 20 times more than that. But there is something about, you know, foggy London and Whitechapel being an area where the police didn't dare to go, and all of the mythology that's come up about it. You know, was it Sir William Gull who was the Queen Victoria's physician who did it? But whatever, it was just how could an individual do such horrible things? And that set me on the course to understand the criminal psychopath, which is, you know, taking up some of my time. The other thing was, how could the German-speaking people, one hesitates before the word German, I'm not really quite sure what that means, have voted to give away the right to vote. I think the referendum in 1938, which included Austria after the Union, the Anschluss, I think it was like 93% people voted to not be able to vote again. Germany itself only having been a democracy because of the Treaty of Versailles, you know, from 1919 or whenever. But nonetheless, how could they give up their rights? And then how could they seek to eradicate the Romani people, the Jews, communists, journalists, blacks, all sorts of categories of people? And how could they believe in the complete nonsense of a purebred race, you know, which, knowing what we know about genetics now, is the most ludicrous of ideas? And those two things, how does society go crazy and how does, you know, or become destructive? And I think so it meant that I studied things in my teens and my 20s about the Holocaust that I probably wouldn't revisit now, because I was dissociated from it in a positive way. It didn't emotionally afflict me. Even though I'm theoretically an empathetic person, sometimes you can step aside from something because you need to understand it, and other times you become associated with it and it becomes overwhelming. And I found with horror movies that there were two choices. One was it would frighten me, and I don't really like that particular feeling, and the other is that it wouldn't frighten me, so what's the point of watching it? So, you know, that you know, something like, you know, that goes off into the edge, like Guillermo del Toro's movies, there's such artistry and art involved in
Mhm.
what, The Shape of Water, or that it's a different thing, or even The Shining, you know, though Stephen King's quite annoyed that his story was changed quite so much, but hey, that's Stanley Kubrick, you know what I mean?
Yeah, Kubrick is he did whatever he wanted, right? He's so not much of a
he's an astonishing character, isn't he? The thought that he decided, was it after Spartacus, that he was never going to work for anybody again, and he would bring together the production monies for what he did. And you know, Orson Welles failed dramatically at that, which is a terrible loss to cinema.
Yeah.
But Kubrick managed to make one film after another with complete control. There's a great documentary by his assistant who was in the what's it called, the 18th century, the movie with Ryan O'Neal, Barry Lyndon. Yeah,
not Barry Lyndon. There is a movie called Barry Lyndon.
Yeah,
is it not? Yeah.
And
about Barry Lyndon. Yeah, Barry Lyndon. About Barry Lyndon.
Yes. No, the other Barry Lyndon, which is a Thackeray, William Makepeace Thackeray novel. This guy was one of the stars in that movie. And working with Kubrick, he went, I've just got to serve this guy. And so for, I think it was 23 years, or some immense period of time, he was subjected to, you know, the dictatorial control of Stanley Kubrick, who was a very angry, bullying human being, and shows that even an authoritarian can do something in the world. Why he always seemed to make two movies in one, so that, you know, in Barry Lyndon, the first half's a great comedy with Leonard Rossiter, and the second half, the character changes completely and becomes horrible. Full Metal Jacket, you have the camp where they train, and Vincent D'Onofrio has a little bit of a problem, bless him, what a brilliant actor. And then they go to war. 2001, you know, he seems to go, oh, all right, we'll make two 1.5 hour movies and stick them together, you know. And
make an experience.
Yeah, which he certainly did, and every film quite different. On the idea of, you know, that I think there is this bizarre idea that education is something that belongs in schools, and that factually, I've been very outspoken for many years about this. I think schools are a dreadful mess for the most part. I'm a big fan of the work of Ken Robinson, Sir Ken Robinson, in fact, his book, The Elements, or Creative Schools, where he's saying, you know, this imposed curriculum, all of these examinations, making school a horrible place. And he speaks of many schools that have broken away from this. And one that I remember is where the kids started going in early, staying in late, going in over the weekend, because this was the place to be. They enjoyed it so much. And academically, they did brilliantly. But the idea was basically that they would do something they really wanted to do. And I think this was the place where they wanted to put a car into the Daytona 500, and they built a car, you know. And so this idea of getting motivation, but the other way is to sneak education in. And the best way is movies. Another example would be One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Which impressed me so much that I actually saw it 3 times in the 1 week run that it was at the cinema. I just went back twice because it was such a staggering piece of work. And that changed psychiatry around the world, certainly in America and the UK, because of the incredibly excessive use of electroconvulsive therapy, which is now used about, you know, in one case in 100 perhaps. You know, then it used to be everybody got it.
There seems to be this tendency in psychiatry to find a miracle cure, and then just be like, well, this is it, obviously, right? This doesn't work. Wow, let's throw in some wires and just like, get that thing going. I think for me, that would have been Clockwork Orange, with all of the, where it's just like, oh my God, like, and obviously the people in Clockwork Orange are not, good people, but it's still, you're still like, oh, this is what you're doing when they do the, like, the videos and all of that, the eyes open. Yeah. That doesn't surprise me. I feel like there should probably be some new movies looking at mental health, but I haven't really, and like the psychiatric system, I'm not. I think the only thing that might come out, because I'm trying to think now, I've read a few thrillers that have to do with psychologists and stuff. I think those have become movies and shows, but they're not very educational. It's definitely more of like, no. They're all very far-fetched. Yeah, there was nothing except, wait, I'm trying to think. In Treatment, I quite liked that TV show, but I'm not sure how accurate it was. Probably not very accurate, since he had an affair with a patient, and that's definitely not it's definitely not very, very approved of in the industry.
Last night I watched Harvey, the James Stewart movie from the 40s, where he believes he has a 6'3" rabbit, or puka, who's invisible to most people, who accompanies him everywhere, and he's an alcoholic, and he's the most genial of people, and everybody loves him. And his sister tries to get him incarcerated because he keeps walking into the parties she's having and upsetting her friends, even though she's living in his house and on his money. And she gets locked up instead of him. And the treatment, the way that, and only for a day, but she basically is stripped naked and put in a bath, this upper middle class woman, which thankfully you don't see. But that it did strike a chord with me. My concern is for authoritarianism, the idea, and I think it's the essential thought of our time, that there are people who want to do as they're told, and there are people who want to tell other people what to do. And if we look at the institution of psychiatry, then there is what you say there about, well, here's a new treatment and it'll, now this will conquer the world and this will do everything.
Yeah.
Which is very much what happens in, groups like Scientology, where you keep getting, this didn't work, but now this will. And when you look at the use of electroconvulsive therapy, it came from, someone will correct me in the comments, I'm sure, but as far as I recollect, the Italian psychiatrist who introduced it was called Looney, and the American psychiatrist who introduced it was called Rabbit.
Oh, okay.
And what they were working on was something that had been noted in the 19th century, and this really does get elaborate and bizarre. In the 19th century, people like Sigmund Freud, before he came up with what somebody else called the talking cure, and he borrowed the expression, he used to do what was standard among alienists, or psychiatrists as they were called, they came to be called, which was that women's hysteria was relieved by stimulating them to orgasm using a machine.
Yeah, the hysteria machine. Yeah, there's been a lot of that. Yeah.
The idea that came from that was that orgasm was a reflection of an epileptic fit in some way, that you were having this convulsive experience.
So like it was like the opposite of the good version of an epileptic
fit?
You
see, after a seizure, epileptics are calm and together and focused. And so the thought was that you were releasing, it's a hydraulic idea. It's the idea that the mind is like a hydraulic machine, pressure builds up and you have to release it, which, by the way, isn't true. But that didn't stop Freud and his mates.
Oh, of course not.
Of course not. They had business to do and money to earn and families to support. And in Freud's case, a lot of cigars to smoke as well, even though he had 33 operations on his throat. He never.
Well, how else can he keep smoking the cigars?
Exactly. You've got to do the important things in life.
Yeah.
So this then becomes water shock, where at the beginning of the 20th century, you'd be put in a kind of rubber sheet and dropped into freezing water, which would induce a convulsion.
Wow.
Then they found that they could give you a big dose of insulin. So their insulin shock was the next thing.
Yeah.
And at the weekends, for their hobby, it would appear that Rabbit and Looney both used to go to abattoirs.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Some people go boating, some people go to the seaside. And they realized that when an animal was shocked to be stunned, it would convulse.
Yeah.
That was the inception of electroconvulsive therapy. In this country, it was introduced by Dr. William Sargent, who would later go on to write Battle for the Mind Manipulators, some of the first books about mind control. And in the paper that he wrote, explaining why he'd introduced electroconvulsive therapy, it wasn't because he believed it was therapeutically useful. He said, simple problem, we have far more people coming to the asylums than we have beds for. This erases the memory of trauma for 6 months or so. And so it's a way of dealing with the flow of people. I mean, but yeah, this idea, and then you get psychic surgery, the idea of cutting bits of people's brains out to.
Yeah. Well, lobotomies in general as well. I read some I didn't read too much, just like a stub. And I was like, well, I have so many things that I'm like, must research more later.
Oh, yeah.
And this is one of them, whereas this woman who was scheduled to have a lobotomy, and then she had written like a short story collection or poetry collection or something, and it suddenly won these awards, and like, oh, cancel the lobotomy, get her writing some more, basically. And I'm just like, this is horrifying to even think about. That's like, yeah, oh my God.
Yeah. And I mean, Ken Kesey saw that working as a nurse when he was a psychiatric nurse when he was at university. He was a wrestling major, Ken Kesey.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
Well, he got in. Actually, he's made. That's not. I've got my terms mixed up. His scholarship was for wrestling.
Yeah, I like the idea of that though. A wrestling major. Now I'm like, you could have so many different courses of like the aerodynamics of thing. You're like wrestling and geometry. Like you could target it really well.
Well, let's sell it. Let's set the course up and sell it. Definitely.
I don't know that much about wrestling though, so I don't know.
Well, I think as we've seen, you don't really need to know anything about something to sell it. In fact, actually, when you look at,
it's probably better.
Well, look at Hitler. He didn't know anything about race, and yet he managed to help to wipe out 50 million people just from his ignorance. And I do wonder. I wonder about that sense of authority that psychiatrists have, and I've met, I belong to a group that was anti-psychiatry, which is partly why I know so much about ECT, because they campaigned against it. But I didn't share their view of psychiatrists because I'd already met one. When I was a teenager, I was befriended by a psychiatrist, and I used to go and have a chat with her because after she'd finished, because she was dealing with all of these poor 14-year-olds who'd either knifed somebody or got pregnant. And it seemed like she needed a bit of therapy. So I used to go and talk with her. And she was a decent person. There were no two ways. So when I was told that all psychiatrists were evil, I didn't quite swallow that.
Yeah.
And after that, I met psychiatrists of both kinds. And some of them were kind of authoritarian narcissist prigs who really loved being, bosses and telling people what to do. And others of them were really compassionate, decent people. So it is interesting the way that authority is assumed. And that's something that, again, we can find out about in the movies. When we last spoke, I mentioned Swimming with Sharks. And
I watched it, and it was, very accurate. And it stars Kevin Spacey, who has come upon hard times, which is sad because even if he is
an unpleasant human being. And I've met one person who spent time with him and said, yeah, he's not a very nice man. But he wasn't actually convicted of anything in the end, I don't think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how I don't know if there was any court stuff or anything because of the way that the statutes work. I feel like there's definitely a lot of problems in the, we had something similar here with, are you familiar with Gian Gomeshi and that whole thing?
No.
Okay, so although I feel like I should mention this little trivia about Kevin Spacey first. I'm friends with someone who works at IMAX, and so she knows a lot of actors and stuff like that. And she said that someone interviewed to be Kevin Spacey's assistant, and like the contract was like, there were certain things in there that were like, wait, what? But you know, if you sign it, like you can't. Well, you know how it is with the contract laws. Like, well, you signed it. What are you gonna do? So I remember hearing about that, and that was way before anything even happened. And I was just like, oh, okay, but we haven't heard anything. So, I mean, you know, you file it away and you're sort of like, okay, that's interesting.
Do you remember what kind of things they were?
Yeah, blowjobs.
In a contract?
You have to give him blowjobs, yeah.
I don't believe it.
I know, and I can't say whether it's true or not because I haven't seen it, but you know, it's...
You can't make a civil contract that violates criminal law.
Well, I don't know what to tell you.
And I think that by now
it could have been implied as well. There's just like, yeah, I don't know. It's not a, yeah. So take it with like a thing of salt, I guess, because it's just from a friend, you know. But yeah, Gian Gomeshi was a radio presenter here in Canada, in Toronto. He did like a music radio program at CBC. So he was working at the CBC and would often do like deep interviews with people. Like he would talk about feminism with like big names and stuff like that and be like, oh, let's talk about these things. And then I'm not sure how it happened, but suddenly it started to come out that someone was like, he abused me. And like, there was like a lot of things. And suddenly there's like, you know, a whole slew of other women that's like me too, like, yeah, just like, oh yeah, we all also experience this. And then you find out that all of the schools that are media schools in Toronto would warn like the women and say like, don't go intern with him, like you can go anywhere else, but just don't go with him. So then it's like, well, then it's known, right? The structure of, there's no way that and he wasn't convicted either because of the way that you know, it boils down to like, well, do you remember what shirt he was wearing? And it's like, well, no, but I remember that, you know, other things happen and then it becomes difficult to prove it in that way. He's doing some podcast now. I heard a commercial for it and I was just like, oh my God, he's okay.
He's back.
So that was definitely a weird, and what was interesting is actually I saw a documentary. I used to, we have a documentary film festival here called Hot Docs. Docs. Every time I say it, people are like, hot dogs? What? Like, what are you saying? No, docs. And there was a Canadian documentary called Slut or Nut. And it's this woman who had experienced sexual assault, and she basically documented the whole thing of like going to trial and like what do you have to do and like meeting with a lawyer and like what do you recommend, because she said like the experience was so like she didn't know anything that was, you know, like, you know, how do you have to go to a hospital? Okay, well, there's only one nurse that does those kits, and then you have to wait at this hospital until, you know, the rounds are and she's up in your place. And so she covered a lot of that. And then as well as, you know, you should always find a lawyer because the state that is pressing the charges is actually not interested in your well-being. They're just interested in protecting, you know, the state. And it was very interesting. And the slut or nut, because it's like, well, either she's a slut or she's a nut, you know, like there's no... but what was really interesting is, so we saw the footage of her going into the courtroom, and it was when the Gian Gomeshi trial was going on. So you saw all of that going on as she's walking by, going to her own trial in the background. And it's just like, there's something about when you understand the context of when things happen to me, that I'm always like, wow, okay, this was all going on at the same time. And she won her case, but it was appealed. and it was overturned. So
Yeah, and I mean that brings us to the side issue of memory, that the judiciary are really not up to date. Certainly for the last 30 years, it's been well known that what is called multiple drafts theory in memory, that every time you describe something, that becomes part of the memory. And so fish get bigger as time goes on. But also that memory is always reconstructed to some extent. And so when you start getting into the trivia of memory, you will almost always be able to catch people out, unless they have eidetic photographic memory, which is very rare. Because it essentially what we remember is the important stuff. And but so I mean I've had the great privilege of being in touch with Professor Alan Shefflin, he's retired now. Well, he's retired as a professor. He's still working all hours that God sends. But he developed what's called the social influence model to be used in court cases for jurors and judges to assess how much influence has been brought to bear, and that it is incredible that this is, judges are ignorant of psychology, that it's quite easy to emotionally persuade somebody in these circumstances.
Yes, and their biases are still there, which isn't to say like, and that's just because they're human, right? It's not a thing of like, oh, we must re-educate all the judges. It's like, you're a human, you're always going to have your biases. It's just like when you start noticing them and you're like, wait, what? For certain cases, and you're just like, what is? Yeah, I've seen some odd statements from judges.
Well, look at in movies, the trial of the Chicago 7, where it's Bobby Seals. And it's real. It really happened. He was strapped to the chair and gagged. He wouldn't speak out, and he's acting in his own defense. So the judge has taken away from him any legal recourse. It was insane. The judge was a crazy person. And again, most systems don't have any checks or balances as to the sanity of judges. And often the judges will enter the age of dementia. We had a Judge Pickles, who, what a great name, who many years ago said he couldn't understand why cannabis was illegal. And of course, in Canada, it isn't now, quite rightly. But, we're all going, yeah, sensible bloke. Then a few weeks later, he's in a case where he's saying that this woman was asking for it by wearing a short skirt. We also had Christmas Humphreys, who was our first Zen Buddhist judge. What a great name, Christmas. Who said that in 99% of cases, criminals would not be appearing before him unless the police and the Crown Prosecution Service were sure that they were guilty. And you're going, that's absolutely ridiculous. You've got cases like, say, Timothy Evans, who was hanged for murders that he very definitely did not commit.
Is that the Rillington?
Yeah, 10 Rillington Place. Amazing.
I was like, that sounds so familiar, that name. I'm like, I've read about this. Yeah.
Oh the original film was with Richard Attenborough, who is absolutely...
Yeah, that's a case that's, well, there's so many of those cases, but yeah, like, you're like, gee.
Yeah. So anyway, coming back to Swimming with Sharks.
Yeah.
It was also released as something like The Buddy Factor, or...
Oh, okay. Wow.
I haven't seen none of that. I first saw it and was really astonished. It's a story of a Hollywood executive, a vice president for production, played by Kevin Spacey, and Frank Whaley plays his assistant. And you see the way that an assistant is treated. Now, not very long after seeing it, I came to know a record producer called Mark Dean, who was on the board of East West Records, which is Atlantic Records in the UK. He was the guy who signed Wham, George Michael, ABC, Five Star, various people.
Yeah.
And he got himself involved with Scientology.
Why not?
I was basically retired by this time. This is about 1996. I really didn't want to, but a lawyer came and pleaded with me to help this guy. So I spent a year coming and going. Whenever I went through London, I'd spend some time with him. And the movie was on somewhere, so I took him to see it. Now, he came up through the industry. He was the assistant to Pink Floyd's original manager, who, when Syd Barrett left Pink Floyd, made the mistake of going with Syd Barrett instead of Pink Floyd. I mean, Barrett's this legend, Ahmet Ertegun, at the head of Atlantic Records. I think he offered $250,000 to be allowed to put a tape recorder in the same room as Barrett for an afternoon. That was how significant Barrett's talent, and he could just sit there and belch if he wanted to, you know, he'd get the $250,000. And Barrett, of course, turned him down. But anyway, this guy had been the manager of Pink Floyd. He was now the manager of Syd Barrett. And when he saw Swimming with Sharks, Mark said, that's exactly the way it is in the music industry. The assistant is treated as dirt. They're on call 24 hours a day. They're, you know, there's a great scene where Spacey's driving along and he's on the phone to his assistant and he's saying, did you get my hair regrowth, my Growgain, to get my hair back? And give me Mindy's number. This woman he's seen, and you have to go out and pimp for them and do all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And it seemed to be a great statement about something that is, you know, I suppose Harvey Weinstein is really exemplifies this horrible situation where people are allowed to get away with things. They're allowed to be bullies, authoritarians, because it's the culture, because it's the way it's done. And it raises the question of, you know, to what extent can we do something about this? And
it's there was a documentary I watched, Kate Nash, she's English, and she had her first album was really, really big. She had a song that became huge, which I really liked. And then
what was the song? Do you remember?
Foundations.
Okay.
Yeah. And so she kind of started, and she was quite young, so she kind of started this the sort of English wave of, like, you know, you can hear the accent and it's a little bit of talk singing. But yeah, so her first album did amazing, and then she got dropped over text by her label, and there's like all of these things that happened, but she's like, I'm gonna keep going. I'm doing a Kickstarter. And then she made this documentary when she was going to try and go tour in America, and she had a new American manager. And it was done so well because you're just seeing it. And then suddenly, you know, it cuts to her with like the phone and it's like, okay, so my manager's been stealing from me, like so the way that you see it, you're just like, oh yeah, you're just experiencing it. And then suddenly, and they even have interviews with the manager that obviously were taken before that. And you're like, this is so, and he's just like, la la. Yeah, he paid for his wedding using her credit cards. Yeah, there was like all of these things. And then there's someone who was saying, like, you know, he now has a bad reputation, but in the music industry, if you have that reputation, a lot of people will be like, oh, that's awesome, that's great, and they'll love that because yeah, that's apparently just, yeah, I don't know. My whole thing has been just to read a lot about these abuses, and then I try to tell people. I don't know. It's you definitely notice how people feel, because I think I told someone about how Sony tricked Michael Jackson because he had the Beatles catalog.
Yeah.
And they wanted the Beatles catalog. And he was like, I'm not selling it to you. And so their solution was, we're not going to promote his album, so he's going to need so much money that he'll sell us the Beatles catalog. Which to me, it was like, that's insane. And, you know, like messing around. And then this girl that I was telling this to, she's like, oh, that's so smart of them though. And I'm like, okay, so you're one of those that thinks that's an impressive, good idea. And I don't, no. Because to me, like, that's awful. Like, but yeah, people will tell on themselves.
And of course, realistically, Paul McCartney would have bought it from him because he was desperately unhappy when he found they'd sold it to him, and
Yeah.
for $120 million or something, which McCartney is like chump change, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that in itself is also like, yeah, what did he have to do with the Beatles? Why is he like, it's like, oh, no, I'm just gonna have this catalog and make some money off it. Yeah, the fact that situation even happened in the first place is also just like, why?
Yeah, but when and it is corruption, it's immorality, and what do we do about that? I mean, I remember a conversation 20 years ago with a very good friend who I said, I think that we need to get rid of corruption in our society. I think we need leaders who are honest. And I'm having great difficulty looking through history, finding any such people. And he took forward the point of view that the best leaders are Machiavellian. And you know, in fact, historically, the only person who really, I think, shines out as an ethical leader, and there probably are others, you know, I mean, Jimmy Carter came close in some ways, I think, in other ways not. But the only person that as yet I've found no fault with is Neville Chamberlain, who is the most despised leader that the British have ever had. But he, you know, at the point, you know, the serious point is that in 1938 at the Munich conference, where he's meant to have, you know, appeased Hitler, this, which was over granting the Sudetenland, part of the newly formed country of Czechoslovakia, giving the Germans that territory, which in fact was completely inhabited by German speakers who wanted to be part of Germany, which is part of it that's not usually in the history books, who had been persecuted by the Czechs. And there's no doubt about that. There was a massacre of 80 German speakers at one point. The deputy premier of Czechoslovakia came to England in, I think, 1936 and boasted, it used to be that the German speakers were here and the Czech speakers were here. Now the Czech.
Yeah.
So this was the feeling there, but we better not put that in the history books.
No, of course not.
But when Chamberlain gets there to Munich, he has a single fact that he knows that many historians seem to have ignored. Britain had 12 high-altitude fighter planes at that point. 12. So in terms of the Luftwaffe and what would later become the Battle of Britain, there wouldn't have been any chance of resisting Germany at that point. So what he did, and it was him who did it, and he started it as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1935, was invest money in the Air Force and building planes. And by the time the Battle of Britain happened, which of course is very shortly after Churchill takes power, so it's nothing to do with Churchill. Churchill wanted to build bombers. But Chamberlain said, no, fighters. By the time the Battle of Britain happened, and Britain would have been lost if that battle had been lost, the aerial battle at the end of 1940, Britain was producing more fighter planes than Germany was. And that was what swung everything. And that was a piece of canny politics. And yet this man is despised, largely because members of the Labour Party, including Michael Foot, who would later become leader of the Labour Party, wrote a book after his death in 1941, blaming him for everything. And it should be said that the Labour Party, when the vote came in 35 to decide what money should be spent on, they voted against any armaments. So the book was called The Guilty Men. And it blamed Chamberlain and one civil servant for having failed to stop Hitler, when the Labour Party had actually said, well, we should not have an army, basically. So, and so we get history constructed by somebody or other along the way. But to me, you know, we need politicians who are honest and honourable. And that, again, leads us into so many wonderful films. Primary Colours, State of the Union with Spencer Tracy, which I'd never heard of before I saw it 3 weeks ago, where you have a candidate for the Republican presidency in 1948 standing against Truman, played by Spencer Tracy brilliantly, who says the wealth of the nation is the health of the nation. And in 1948 seems to be promoting Obamacare, you know, a Republican, you know, what are we going to do? But I think that, you know, maybe to wrap this up, or to start a point with which to wrap it up, that movies are really influential.
Mm-hmm.
And we live within a culture. I 20 years ago started working on a book, part of which became the book which is now Opening Our Minds. But I came to the conclusion that what was significant, you know, understanding all the ways of amplifying our groupthink and making us socially compliant, making us fervent about ideas, creating a certainty within us that is based
Mm-hmm.
upon emotion rather than evidence. All of these things fit within a culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the culture is something that's influenced by creative people, by writers, artists, actors, directors, you know, by the and you know, majorly in my generation, through my youth, more than any other cultural form, through musicians.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we all wanted to imagine no possessions. But how much was that piano worth that he was playing that on? So £150,000 piano or something. But he could imagine it at least, you know.
Yeah.
And the apartment block where, you know, one floor was a refrigerated unit for Yoko's fur coats, but you know, but we believed what those songs were saying about peace and love and all of that stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you know, and then you see something like, say, Gangster, which came out of absolute grievances about what was happening in South Central and you know, well, in Watts, in, you know, Compton.
Mm-hmm.
Real things that were taking place and real art that was made from them, but that then became this, you know, middle class Tupac Shakur culture. And Tupac was brilliant, don't get me wrong. His mum was even more brilliant. She's the woman who won the Panthers 21 case.
Mm-hmm.
An amazing
Wow.
piece of history, but and then became a crack addict, sadly. But there, he grew up. Tupac didn't grow up in the hood, you know, and you start getting this adoption of, you know, Snoop Dogg's sort of ethic.
Mm-hmm.
Though Snoop Dogg, of course, I didn't buy it, but I was in a thrift store and I saw a copy of his cookery book.
Yeah, he had was it with Martha Stewart? I know him and Martha Stewart were doing something together. I just know because I saw this on Tumblr, and it's so funny to be on Tumblr because you notice the age divide so starkly. Because, well, the other day there was someone who was like, I don't know who Tom Cruise is, and I was like, wow. But
what a satisfying thought.
I know, but it's also slightly weird because he has had movies, you know, recently, right? So I'm like, wow, it's definitely going to a certain audience that is not on Tumblr.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's the thing with Snoop and Martha, and they were like, oh my God, why? Oh, Snoop, like, oh God, what was it? It was something about, oh, you look at this and like she's the one who's been to jail and he hasn't, and then it's like, oh, you guys don't know anything about what has happened in the past, do you? You're just like, you just see this photo and be like, yeah, we're making our opinion on this. It's like, well, there's history, you know, things have happened in the past. Yeah, cookbook. I'm not sure what kind of recipes are in there though. So.
Gangster cuisine.
I feel like he could do a weed cookbook probably.
Yeah, if he could stay straight for long enough to be able to write it, you know what I mean? But yeah, such a, I mean, Jimmy Iovine and Dr. Dre, I can't remember what, there's a 6-part documentary, which is just one of the most wonderful things. Finding out how NWA came up and how Dre and Iovine make this partnership. So you get this kind of fairly middle of the road producer meeting with Dr. Dre, one of the great talents of our time, and they make $1 billion.
Yeah.
They make $1 billion.
Yeah.
But it shows you the whole history of, you know, these two guys and the music industry, and that tremendous influence, which is a powerful, I don't think that art should be constrained to teaching us to be good, but I do think that there's a very valuable place of exposing evil.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it always coming back to the same thing, showing what human predators are like,
mm-hmm.
how they behave. As in Buddy, there's that great line in Swimming with Sharks where Guy's doing Buddy's laundry and he's saying, the lessons that he learns from, and so this morning, Buddy had thrown his bagel at him. And so they say, well, what did you learn from that? He said, well, I learned not to put too much cream cheese on Buddy's bagel, which is a life lesson well worth learning.
Yeah. Oh my God. That just because you were saying like it shows you how predators work, that just made me think of The Talented Mr. Ripley.
Oh, brilliant novels and brilliant films too.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it's also, and it's not scary in the traditional way because it's so slow, and yet you're like, oh wait, no, like, oh, okay, things are happening. Yeah, I thought that one was definitely a good example. But I definitely think you should watch The Assistant. I think that one is the newest, and it kind of reflects on a Weinstein-esque figure, but also not. It's very also like detached, which makes it look more realistic. I feel like the feeling of what happens. And we got a fantastic, what's his name? Matthew McFadyen in it as well. So yeah.
Great. I will do that. And so we'll keep doing this because this is so much fun. Waffling endlessly.
I mean, isn't that what we live for? Just talking and, maybe that's just me. I love talking movies and general things. Yeah.
I do believe that conversation is the foundation of civilization. Well, it's almost a rap song, isn't it? Yeah. Conversation, the foundation of civilization. Skeltonic verse, as it's known, coming from a man called John Skelton, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare and invented that way of doing things, which would become rap ultimately. So one of the common mistakes, the idea that blues is the devil's music, which is repeated again and again, along with the complete nonsense story of Robert Johnson meeting the devil at the crossroads. It was Tommy Johnson, not Robert Johnson. In the song Crossroads, Robert Johnson points out that when he went to the crossroads, he fell down on his knees and asked the Lord for mercy. He didn't get his guitar tuned by the devil. That was Tommy Johnson, who Robert Johnson would have known. He was an older contemporary. But the idea that it's the devil's music comes from the original name, which is the Blue Devils, which again belongs to the time of Shakespeare. That to have the Blue Devils means to be sad, means to be melancholic. And so the mistake came in thinking that it was the devil's music because it was you got the Blue Devils.
Yeah.
We have to be very careful about these things.
Yeah. I think that was emo recently because that got banned everywhere. People were like, oh no, emo is taking over. Yeah. Russia banned it. And I think and I think Mexico too, which I'm like, how are you banning a genre of music that technically doesn't even have a description? Because you can't describe emo. It doesn't. The original emo you can describe because it actually belonged to certain bands, and you're like, yeah, the emotive hardcore, blah blah blah. But then you can't really describe what's the Fall Out Boy, My Chem. Like there's nothing really. They're just in the same space because that's what we've decided. But yeah, banned from Russia, Mexico. Those were fun days.
Under Hitler, one of the few protest movements with people who listened to jazz. They had to do it in secret because you could be sent to a concentration camp for listening to jazz because it was degenerate.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of, again, you hear there are great interviews in the 50s with learned professors talking about the moral degeneration of rock and roll and what it will lead to. And then you see how the industry picks something up. I mean, I'm the great rock and roll swindle.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that punk is a designer form, that now the music industry can get on top of this. Originally people like Malcolm McLaren, but pretty quickly the industry got the idea.
Yeah.
And real punk bands like, I don't know, Sham 69, there were all of these other bands who were basically the Clash or the Jam, who, for example, who were really good at what they did. They weren't punk bands. But Susie and the Banshees, not really a punk band, very competent musicians who the music industry is now pushing forward, and the people at the New Musical Express shoving along. And you get this kind of culture control,
yes,
which thankfully the internet is capable of breaking. That there will be waves of, and you experienced it very directly,
mm-hmm.
the Stan environment. There will be these waves of fervor, but it's also possible for people, survivors like you and me, to talk about these things and maybe, spread some other, some way of looking at things so that people can stand up and say, no, this is what I like,
mm-hmm.
rather than, oh, I like this because I meant to, or, Donald Trump is.
I've noticed that it's so weird, especially online. It's this emphasis on who is doing well in the charts, and I'm like, I don't think I've ever paid attention to charts in my life. Like, why would I care about that? It seemed very like, don't you want to be backing the winning horse? And it's like, no, I want to listen to things that I like. Like, I don't, it's not about, the only thing I care about with the charts and that stuff is that the artist would make enough money that they can keep going, basically, and don't get dismissed. But this whole thing is like, well, this person has more streams. It's like, okay, did you leave your computer on all night to get to that number? Like, why does that matter, really? But it does matter very much.
It
to these
brings
people.
us to the heart of the authoritarian problem. I think Eric Fromm, the wonderful, brilliant Eric
mm-hmm.
Fromm, put forward the idea that most people, the majority of people, won't really develop a self. So he talks
mm-hmm.
about the pseudo self way back in a book called Escape from Freedom in 1941. He's saying, oh, this is how Nazi Germany rose up, because less and less people are maturing properly and developing a self. And the way that you see that is exactly what you're talking about. It's what's everyone else doing?
Mm-hmm.
How can I join the herd? How can I join the mob? And every now and then in history, we get some individual who try and break this. A famous example would be Beau Brummel and his group, who are called the Dandies. And almost everybody's got the wrong idea that dandies are meant to be people who dress up. Well, there were people who actually stopped wearing periwigs and powder and wore black and simple things.
Yeah.
But when Brummel makes that assertion, or somebody like Oscar Wilde comes forward as an individual, a load of people copy them.
Yeah, for sure. And it's so interesting too, like the way that it is constructed, because I read this book called The Song Machine. So it goes over like, and it is very much about the machine behind the creation of these things. And it was called, is it Napoleon's rule of three? There's a specific like rule that he mentioned to do with radio, where the way to create a hit is to make sure that people hear it everywhere. And then they think it's a hit, and then you've made a hit. So that's basically, and then he just explains how they do it. So you talk to the radio and like, okay, we'll premiere it at this time and then do it this way, and you see it as well. Once you pay attention, you can see like the marketing pushes and like, the way that all coincides. But the hit thing was really interesting because it just shows how, well, I don't know what the situation is in the UK, but in the US, the radio stations all are under one conglomerate, who then also happens to own all of this thing and then owns all of this thing. And, Ticketmaster and Live Nation are together. And, everything is so interwoven that it becomes very purposeful, Yeah, and it's just like, okay, wow.
And we see it again and again. If you go back to the Elvis Presley's first songs, They're great. I didn't think so, as a kid, but looking back to Heartbreak Hotel and All Shook Up and Jailhouse Rock, they're great. And then you get Colonel Tom Parker, and you see the complete degeneration of this talent under that influence. And it's often the case that somebody becomes marketed and packaged, and they stop having their individuality. And again, the fight against authoritarianism is the fight for individuality. And that is my mind was changed a long time ago. I read this thing about a guy who made ice cube trays, and this was back in, I think it was back in the late 50s, so a while back. And somebody called him and said, "Oh, the ice tastes so bitter." And so he tried some, it didn't taste bitter to him. And then somebody else, and then somebody else. And they found that 1 in 1,000 people could taste this chemical that the plastic was giving off. And that was a little light went on for me that said, yeah, we're all of us different. That I have a friend who doesn't eat salmon or melon. They're things I like.
Yeah.
So not keen on cantaloupes, I must admit. But the other kinds of melon I like. But to her, they're anathema.
Yeah.
And it's the same with all arts, with everything in culture, that we should be refining our own sensibilities. And certainly to become an artist, to become worthwhile creatively, you basically have to find out what it is you like and put that forward into the world. As a painter, as a director, it's what's unique and different about you, maybe even eccentric about you, that will give you a voice, that will make you something. As Picasso said, the paintings in the museums are the failures. They're the ones that failed to comply with what you were meant to do, and so it goes. Anyway, this has been fantastic, great fun. Let's do it again in a few weeks' time.
Yeah.
And I'm John Atack, and this is my guest Monia, and we've enjoyed talking at you all. And we hope you've enjoyed it too. So thanks very much. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. Gangster cuisine.